My cousin Peter's here, and he says, you're going to be 80 years old, Hoonrey. Why don't you just tell us about your life? It's been a fabulous life. I was born in Jamaica, Long Island. My mother and father lived there, not too far from my grandparents who were in Brooklyn. And I think I was about 6 months old when we moved out to Floral Park on Long Island. And my Aunt Dottie and Uncle Jewel, mother was one of 4 children, and Uncle Jewel was the oldest, and they lived out on Long Island and in Floral Park. And Aunt Eleanor, who was a year younger than Mother, she lived in Belrose, and that was the next town to Floral Park. And Aunt Madeline lived in Brooklyn with my grandmother and grandfather until she married a widower who lived in Floral Park, and so she moved out to Floral Park. And we had a very close family. My father worked in New York City for the New York Life, and he would come home in the afternoon at about 3 o'clock, and he'd always stop at Cushman's and get buns. And Aunt Madeline and Aunt Dottie and the cousins and whomever, all different times. Every day there was somebody at our house having buns and coffee. Anyway, I forgot to tell you about when I was a little girl. I remember having a little dog named Sookie, and she was just the most adorable little Boston Bull, who was my dearest friend. And I'd take that dog out on the sled, and she was so good, she'd just sit on the sled when I pulled her in the snow. And she went into the sandbox with me and went everywhere. Anyway, Sookie was my best friend. And pretty soon, about 7 years after I was born, my brother came along. And of course, he was a little tyrant, but that's the way brothers are. Anyway, we did have a fun time. We're having even more fun now that we're old people. I had just a fabulous life. Grew up during the war, but I was too young to understand what the war was all about, except that you saw the headlines, and when you went to the movies, you saw newsreels, and it was all about the war. Well, I was just having too much fun, both in grammar school and in high school. In high school, I was a cheerleader, and that was a big part of my life. I was pretty good in school, graduated, and went to college. Mother gave me a choice of going to Europe and spending a year in Europe with her cousin Madeline, who lived in Paris. I could do that, or I could go away to junior college and be away for 2 years, or I could stay at home and go to college living at home for 4 years. Well, I told you I wasn't really too stupid, so definitely I took the 4 years. And I had a great time in college. I started getting very poor marks after about the first 6 months. And when I finally did graduate, my father said, well, Hoonrey, you did graduate, he said, but I think that the A's that you got were in sorority, in social chairman, and in bridge, which he taught me to play, and cheerleading, of course. But I did learn a lot, and I learned what life was all about. I met a man when I was down at the Jersey Shore. He was not a man, he was a very good-looking young boy. He was, I think, 20 years old. I was not quite 18. It was the end of both of our juniors in college. He went to the University of Vermont. And I think it was his girlfriend from the summer before who took me up to the room where all the waitresses lived during the summer at the Monmouth Hotel in Spring Lake, New Jersey. And she apparently met this guy down at the local bar that evening and said, "Have I got a girl for you?" And so the next day he came down to the beach, and we got to, after serving breakfast, we had a little bit of time off before we had to go in and serve lunch. And he came down to check out the merchandise. And Mother was a smart woman. She bought me a magenta bathing suit, and it was very well boned. I was never really a buxom blonde, but in that bathing suit I looked pretty good. Anyway, Les came down, checked out the merchandise, and decided, well, it wasn't so bad. Maybe he'd ask this girl out. So being Les, he got 8 different people, from Freddie the fry cook to Joe the busboy to a couple of the waitresses, to ask Helen Collins if she would like to have a blind date with Les Collins. Well, she said no to the first 4. But when the 5th one came along, she wondered, who is this guy? And she said, okay, I'll go out with him. I'll never forget Les that night, because I wound up going out with a skirt and a little white blouse, and he said, what happened? And he decided a little while after that maybe he'd be a leg man instead of a boobs guy. Anyway, we had a wonderful, wonderful summer. He came every night and picked me up, and we went out, stayed out late, and got back and put in another day's work. He was a lifeguard, a couple of hotels down. And his mother and father and his grandmother came down probably about 4 days after I had met Les, and they brought him a new car, and it was a yellow Chevy convertible. And good Lord, how could you turn away this good-looking guy in this adorable car? Well, I kind of thought he was awfully, well, I shouldn't say stuck up, but it seemed to me that he pranced through the sand and was very sure of himself. Well, of course he had been in the Navy a couple of years, so maybe he was sure of himself. Anyway, we did spend the summer together and had a great time. When he went back to school, he invited me to come in and visit up at the University of Vermont. And his mother and father were going up for the weekend, and it was probably in October. Gorgeous, gorgeous weather. So I got over to New Jersey, and they drove me up to Vermont along with Aunt Laura and Uncle Ray. Aunt Laura being my mother-in-law's sister. And those 4 did everything together. They absolutely had a wonderful time. Anyway, I got up to Vermont and had a fabulous weekend. And I got back to Long Island after a long weekend, and I thought that this guy was absolutely the greatest. Well, then I went up. He came down at Christmas time, and I guess Thanksgiving also, and then had invited me to come up to the Dartmouth Winter Carnival. Well, I think I went up, I think I flew up. That was the first time I'd ever flown in an airplane. And had a fine time until I found out that he had another girlfriend. And that really upset me terribly. But anyway, I decided I was going back to Adelphi College and knock every guy that I met on his feet, and that's how I was going to hurt men. Well, I did for a while, but then this Les Collins, being Les Collins, started sending me presents. And driving from Vermont, which took, in those days, probably about 6 hours, he would drive down and park in my driveway in Floral Park and stay there overnight and come in the morning And my mother and father loved him because he could do anything. And he would spend the day with my parents after driving me to work. And he would pick me up from work. And a couple of times, I can remember this happening so vividly, I had another date. And he would be sitting in the living room with my mother and father when this date would arrive, and off we would go. And that was Les. I mean, he didn't care. Well, he sent me presents from Vermont. Most of the presents came from when they had a sale in the Lost and Found. So I would get beautiful scarves and mittens and all kinds of things that he had bought from the Lost and Found. He also would send me roses. It turned out that if I got one, it might be a real one that came in, from a florist. But very often, it was a dozen red roses, and he cut those out of magazine from the 4 Roses ad and put them all together and sent them to me. He wrote me poetry. I'm telling you, we just had this up and down relationship, but finally my best friend Nancy was up in Vermont when Les was there, I think going to summer school. And she had a date with one of Les's friends, and Les had a date, and they went out. And when Nancy came home, she said, "You know, Helen, you're really nuts. This guy is fantastic." And so, after a while, I finally let him back into my life. And you'd think that this was all over a few years. Well, it wasn't. By the time we were graduating from college, which was when, like 2 years after I met him, I was engaged to him. And the year later, we were married.
How are you now?
Okay, what a life we had. There was just so much, and it was 36 fabulous, almost 36 fabulous years. We had such terrific parents, and also the rest of our family. One thing that I remember, we lived in a little apartment in Rutherford, New Jersey, and Les, having worked in the Navy as a pharmacist maid, when I didn't become pregnant right away, he thought maybe that he was sterile from working in with X-ray. Well, it didn't take too long, for heaven's sakes, when Leslie, our firstborn, arrived, and we knew that he wasn't sterile. Anyway, we were all just absolutely thrilled with this baby. My mother and father, and Les's mother and father, just couldn't wait to be with us, to have this first grandchild. We had a lot of fun. It wasn't very long, like maybe 3 months, when Leslie was 3 months old, when I went for a checkup at the doctor's, and he said, "Helen, you're pregnant." And I said, "Oh, I couldn't be." Well, he said, "Oh, yes, it can." And sure enough, just about a year and a few days after Leslie was born, Victoria arrived. And more fun with the grandparents. I mean, we did so much together. And now Les thought, we've got to get a house. So we went looking. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to remember the year exactly. I know when we moved into the house, Victoria was just a baby. So it must have been after Leslie was born and I was pregnant that we decided we had to have a house. Well, we had heard about this town in Connecticut called Westport, and when we got to Westport looking for land or a house, it turned out to be a little bit too expensive for us. So we went to the next town, which was called Wilton, Connecticut. And after much looking, we finally found some property for $2,000 an acre. And we had saved our gifts from when we were married, money gifts. And we also made a few little investments in the stock market. And we wound up with enough money to buy this property, and it cost us $5,000. Well, now when we went to get a mortgage to build a house, I think we started with the Prudential, where Les's father and grandmother worked. Well, they turned us down. And so we decided to look for a house that was already built. And we found one, and my mother and father and Les's mother and father came up and looked at the house, and they thought it was okay. My mother-in-law didn't like it because it had linoleum floors. Anyway, my father had never seen our property, and so we took him over to see the property. And my father always did use language a little bit, not to, Jesus Christ, Hoonrey, live here for crying out loud. He said, pitch a tent, but live on this property. So we tried a bank in Wilton, Connecticut, and sure enough, they gave us a mortgage. And so we built a house, and it started out with just a living room, dining room, kitchen, but it was called oh dear, what was it called? A ranch split level. And I know, a modern colonial ranch split level. And in the back, you could see that it was 2 stories, but in the front, it was brought up to the front door, which was on the 2nd level. Anyway, living room, dining room, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Well, I don't know what happened, but it was only a year later when Christopher was born. And so now we had 2 bedrooms and we had 3 children. And poor Christopher lived in the dining room for quite some time, and then Les decided, well, maybe he would finish the downstairs. There's lots of stories about the downstairs, but anyway, we had a playroom, and he built a den and another bedroom for us downstairs. Well, it wasn't too many years later when all of a sudden Laura Lee arrived. And so we, did we put on no, we didn't put on an addition yet. But in 1963, Les decided to build a barn. And he went to the town hall to find out, or to get a permit to build this barn. And they took the number of our lot in Wilton, and there was no map of our house, but there were some men there, and they were working on a proposed road that would be going through Wilton, Connecticut. Well, it was to be the new Route 7, and it went right through our property. At that point, we were expecting our 5th child, and now we had 3 bedrooms, and we couldn't sell a house because it was in the path of the new Route 7. And I said, Les, this is absolutely ridiculous. We cannot live in a house with 3 bedrooms with 5 children. And so he said, well, we're going to add on, which we did. And we put on a porch and 2 more bedrooms downstairs and a great big playroom. And we had a wonderful, wonderful house. That went on for quite some time. And the state came along and decided they had to buy our house. It was wonderful because that house was, it was just so different than any other normal house. I mean, Les had his fingers in it all over the place. And the state wanted to get a valuation of this house so that they could buy it from us. Well, they had a couple of realtors and then an estimator that came in. And all three of them came within like $5,000 of each other. And it was a whole lot more than the state thought that they should be paying. They weren't paying that much money for any of the house. But the living room had beams, the downstairs had beams, old beams from old barns. Well, I just can't tell you how exciting that house was. Anyway, the state paid the money, and Les being Les, went down to the bank to buy some treasury bills. We were allowed to stay in that house. We had to start paying rent to the state of Connecticut until we had our next house built. But in the meantime, Les went to the bank to buy some treasury bills. And friends that met him down in Wilton Center almost wanted to ignore the fact that they knew Les, because he, on a Saturday morning, would have on an old cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and probably bell-bottom trousers that had gone out of style 4 years or 5 years before that. But that's the way he was. Anyhow, he went into the bank, and he went up to Mr. Brown's desk, and Mr. Brown said, "Who are you?" And he said, "My name is Les Collins. I'd like to buy some treasury bills." And Mr. Brown said, of course Les was in this outfit that I'm telling you about. Mr. Brown said, "And how are you going to pay for those?" And Les reached in his pocket, and he came out and he said, "Cash?" And Mr. Brown said, "Mr. Collins, would you please sit down?" And so he got his treasury bills, and he had been working, looking for a piece of property for quite some time. Unfortunately, in the meantime, we had a great tragedy in our life. Our fifth child got out when he was 2 years old and went across the street and drowned in a fish pond. I did not want to be anywhere near water, and Les found a beautiful piece of property, but it was on a lake, and I just couldn't face that. So he kept looking and looking, and he found a place at the top of the hill on Nod Hill in Wilton, and he negotiated and negotiated and negotiated with Mrs. Leary, who finally submitted to selling him 12 and a half acres of land. Now, Mrs. Leary made us, the two of us, sign an agreement that we would not sell any of that property for 10 years, which we did, and we did not sell that property. It was just a fabulous place. And Les found some crazy young builder who was interested in building a house out of old wood. Now he got 3 local high school boys to help him take down 3 barns. Two of the barns were pre-Civil War, and the third one was pre-Revolutionary War. And it was just fantastic wood and incredible beams. I know when he built this house, which he and this crazy builder built, they had 6 by 6, I think, 6 by 6 chestnut beams that were in the living room. In the living room, the center was 33 feet high. in those days, that was pretty high. We didn't have the McMansions that there are today. But that was the one room that had this ceiling, and it was just more fun because we put a Christmas tree in it every year. Now, the Christmas tree had to take 3 or 4 of our men friends or big boys to get that tree through the front door. The tree was always about 23 feet high, except for one year when I came home. That was the year that we had an ice storm, and I took the 2 youngest children out to Long Island because there was electricity out there. We had none in Connecticut for a full week. And so when I came home, Les came rushing out to the garage as I pulled in. He said, "Helen, you've got a hair appointment. You've got to turn around and get right to Joseph's because he's waiting for you." And I said, "Oh, fine." Well, I went to Joseph's and I came back, and what did I find but a 33-foot Christmas tree in my living room. Well, you can imagine what a 33-foot Christmas tree looked like at the base. I mean, it practically took up the whole living room. And I said, "Unless you do this ever again, and I'm going to go to Florida for the winter, for Christmas, and you can stay here with the children." Well, it was never 33 feet again, but it was something else, I'll tell you. Anyhow, there are so many stories about Les, but when he was building this house, he had his own backhoe. He bought a backhoe, and its name was Oliver. And Oliver, Les himself dug the foundation for this house with Oliver. And one day he came home, and he did not need sleep. I mean, he just was so alive all the time. If he slept 6 hours at night, it was a miracle. Anyway, he always got up whistling, happy as could be. But he dug this ditch, and one night he came home, and he was always sure that I was happy. He wanted me to be happy. And one way to make me very happy was to be playing bridge. And so he said, "Helen, I don't feel like eating dinner." He said, "When the company comes, I'll be out, and I'll be just fine." And so we had 2 tables of bridge, our friend from Wilton, and he came in, and probably about after an hour, he passed out. And what happened was, I didn't find this out until I opened a piece of mail of his one day, which I never did. But it was a report from his annual physical. And I always wanted to find out how much weight he needed to lose. So I opened up his account of the physical, and I saw that what had happened to him was he had a great big gash in his leg. He had to go to the hospital, and they finally, and he stayed there for a while, they grafted skin from one, I think probably from his behind onto his leg because this gash was so big. Well, what had happened was he had fallen into the pit for the foundation of the house, and Oliver had fallen in on top of it and cut his leg. But God forbid, he wasn't going to tell me that. No way. He just got a cut over at the house. So that was partly less. He did a tremendous amount of building of that house. He got all kinds of stuff from the Stanford Wrecking Company. He had the most interesting windows. He had like a round window that was cut in half in the middle, that he put one side of it in one end of our living room and the other in the other side. He had a fan window. All of these things were old things. It was a house that wound up in several magazines, and it was totally his doing. That we had an architect, that's another story. I insisted he get an architect because what did he know about building? Well, we had the architect, and Les told him what he wanted to do. Actually, he had built a little miniature house that he wanted to have built, and the architect said that it couldn't be done. We wanted to do it for $75,000. After he brought a plan back for something totally other than what we wanted, I paid the architect $2,000, and that was the end of that, and Les finished making up the plans for himself, and he built the house that he wanted, which was a barn. He did things like birthday presents that I got. Who gets a piece of a slab of slate and is told that this is going to be the floor of the fireplace? Another thing he gave me were 2 lion heads that he had gotten from a town hall that they were tearing down, and he bought these lion heads and had those built into the sides of the fireplace. The fireplace was absolutely fantastic. You walked into it. And thank goodness for that fireplace, because that ice storm I told you about, well, he stayed in New York and I was home with the children, and we just had to open a can of tuna fish, for heaven's sakes, and whatever else we could find that you didn't need electricity for. We made a fire and put a bridge table practically into the fireplace, and that's where we sat and had whatever food we could scrounge up and play games. We had a good time, but a good time doesn't last very long when you're freezing cold. I know I had the dog sleeping with me just to have the warmth of that dog, but it wasn't very comfortable for sleeping. Les was much better. Okay, before I go on with the ice storm, for heaven's sakes, I'm back on Parish Road in Wilton, and I totally forgot that after John died, I did not, for the life of me, want any more children, but Les was an only child, and he was just crazy to have a big family. And sure enough, all of a sudden, there was another baby, and her name was Elizabeth, and she arrived in 1967. She was 3 years old when we moved to the house on Non Hill. And getting back to the ice storm, she and Laura Lee were the 2 youngest, and they're the ones that I took to Long Island to stay with my mother, and to see my Aunt Madeline. When I grew up on Long Island, it was always family, family, family. We had a great big yard, and my birthday is the 28th of May, and it's obviously very close to Memorial Day. And that was the beginning of the season. And Daddy had a sign that he made up, and it was basket parties welcome. And when Mother would be inviting Aunt Eleanor, Aunt Dottie, and Aunt Madeline and their families over, we would have a great big party. Daddy had the grill going, and they would all bring their baskets. So this sign said, "Basket parties welcome," and we had such fun. Okay, I'm getting sidetracked. I'm now back in Wilton, Connecticut on Non Hill, and enough with the Christmas trees, but taking the Christmas trees down was quite an experience. Les would get the chainsaw, and he would take all the branches off the bottom part of the tree, and the children would be putting those into the fireplace, and what gorgeous fires they were, for heaven's sake. I don't think it was the best thing to do, because just think of all that pine burning up and that sap and so forth. But that was less. It was an easy way to clean up. I think I ought to tell you about some of our trips. The first trip that we took was in it was when John was a baby, so it was 1964. And Les worked very, very hard in the advertising business, and he needed a rest. And when he was away, he would be away for 3 weeks at a time, because he'd be out in California shooting a commercial, and very often it would rain, and so they'd be postponed, and he would be there over a weekend. And when you were gone on a weekend, you would get 4 days extra vacation time. So at one point, he was up to having 6 weeks of vacation. And he said, Helen, I think we ought to go to Europe. Well, we made arrangements. At this point, we were very, very lucky to have a girl from South America living with us. And she was there. Her name was Marina, and she came from Columbia, South America. And she was a great help to me. We had such a good time. She spoke no English, and I did not speak Spanish, that every afternoon we would get together and we would have the dictionary, the Spanish-American dictionary, and we would each learn a few words. Anyway, Marina was there, and our wonderful parents, they were just so good to us. They would come up, and Marina was there. My mother and father would come up and stay for maybe a week, and then they would go home, and Les's mother and father would come up and stay. So now, don't forget, when John was born, that was 1963. My first child was born practically the last day of 1955. So there's not that many years. So just think about these wonderful parents who came up and stayed with our children so we could go off and probably make more babies. Anyway, we went to Europe for 6 weeks. We went over on the Leonardo da Vinci. I can remember vividly that my mother-in-law called up one day. We were still on Parish Road. She called up to say that Dad, Les's father, was diagnosed with cancer. And I said, Les, we've got to cancel our trip to Italy. And Les, being an only child who was so devoted to his parents, but he was a very, very smart man, said to me, Helen, you don't sit around waiting for people to die. You live your own life. Well, we did live our own life, and we went to Italy on the Leonardo da Vinci and got as far as Genoa, and our only reservation was for an automobile. And we went to see his boss from BBDO, who had a villa on Lake Garda. And we spent a week with Bob and Betty Foreman, and they took us to Venice. We went to Venice for like 3 days and stayed at the Daniele Hotel. Well, when Les got the bill for the Daniele Hotel, when we got in our car and went off, he said, Helen, that's the last orange juice you're going to have in in Italy. He said, from now on, if you need citrus, we're buying it at a fruit stand. He said, we just spent practically half the money that we had put aside for Europe at the Daniele Hotel. Well, anyhow, we just had a wonderful time from then on. We wound up in, I think, my most favorite place in Italy, which is Positano. And we got to Positano, and we were at the Cyrenus Hotel, which is magnificent. And we had to climb down, I can't tell you how many stairs, but you just went down one time a day, because you certainly couldn't climb up those stairs, even though you were 34 years old, too often. But anyhow, we climbed down one day, and we rented a little rowboat. And before we rented the rowboat, he went to a little delicatessen, and he didn't speak any Italian, but he would make it up. And he did know one word, and that was basta. That was enough. So he would point to things at the deli. First he got a loaf of bread, and then he had the deli guy cut it in half through the center, and then he had him slice salami. And after a while he'd say basta, and then he'd slice some cheese, and that was basta. Then he bought a bottle of wine, and the man gave us a string to tie around the wine so we could drag it behind the boat so it would stay chilled. And off we went, and I mean, we're a little tiny rowboat with a small motor, and we went down the coast to Amalfi and just had a wonderful time. We came back. We were overlooking the most gorgeous gold dome of the church from our balcony, which was just magnificent. And we were to go back to London, to fly out of London. And I said, Les, I don't want to leave here. It's just too perfect. And we were going to spend 3 days in London, and so in those days, you just got on the telephone, you called the airline and said, could I please change my reservation from wherever it was back to Rome? We want to fly out of Leonardo da Vinci Airport instead of London. And it was done right over the phone, perfect, no problem. Anyway, that was our first trip, which was totally fabulous. We came home and we were both nicely relaxed and fine. I can remember climbing, I think it was at, oh dear, I can't remember the place, but it was fountains and no, not Da Vinci. Well, I can't remember. But anyhow, climbing. And we saw quite a few old people. And Les said to me, Helen, we have got to do this at least every 5 years. Because when you're retired, you can't climb these stairs. And boy, do I know that now. Although I still keep trying. Anyway, that was our first trip. And I can remember vividly one day him coming home and saying, I've got to go to Italy tomorrow. Can you get your mother to come up and stay with the kids? And I said, sure. And I went to get my passport. My passport was expired, and I couldn't go. Well, I'll tell you, my passport has never been expired since. I have made sure that I'm always ready to go, because I could be ready to go at any time. Trying to think what the next trip was, but I did get to go with him several times on trips to Europe. But I also got to go, sorry, I have to answer the phone. I'm fine. I'm just recording my life. Oh, good. Pete is here, and he came to do Jet, and Jet had lunch, and so Pete said, well, "Come on, Hoonrey, let's do you." So that's what we've been doing. It's fun. Well, I'm ready. Here I am again. It's the next day. Pete and Betty and Jet and I went up to Chris's restaurant last night, and it was fantastic. Anyway, back to the interview. I was telling you about my trips, and I did get to go to South America with Les he was shooting a Sheraton commercial, and it was great fun, except I got a terrible sunburn. Anyway, my mother and Les's mother came up. This is after the fathers had died, which was sad in our lives. But they still came and stayed with the children, and I still got to go away in the wintertime. When you live in Connecticut, somewhere around February you get very depressed because it's just gray too often. And I like sunshine. And so I would go off to either California or to Florida with Les while he was shooting his commercials. I was just so lucky because I had such a fabulous life. I mean, I had terrific children, and after I lost John and after Elizabeth was born, I know that we used to take the children to Community Park to go swimming. Well, Community Park got so crowded, and I used to have the kids all in red bathing suits so I could see them. And finally, Les submitted to joining a country club. He never wanted to be at a country club. He really didn't care about fancy people. Well, we joined the country club. I was so happy. There was a wonderful lifeguard to take care of the children. I had a sitter on the right on the road to the club who took care of Elizabeth, and I would go and jump on to the first tee, play 18 holes, come back, have lunch, and then go and pick up Elizabeth and come back to the pool. And she would be in a playpen. We'd have just a great afternoon and go on back home. We met such wonderful people, and all of a sudden Les decided he really did like the country club. He wasn't going to play golf. I think he figured out that each time he played golf, it cost him about $2,000, but he didn't care. I was happy, and that's important, that Helen is happy. I just can't stop talking about Les because he was so amazing. He just made every day count, and he went everywhere, and his eyes never missed anything. I mean, even when he was driving the car, for heaven's sakes, he didn't miss anything that was going on either side of the road. I think that's how we learned to build our house, was just walking around in New York City and watching the development of buildings when he was on his lunch hour. Anyway, he did do that. I told you about that. After the traveling, I think I'll tell you about the children. Leslie was our firstborn. I told you about Leslie and how we all were just crazy about having a baby in our family. Victoria was my first to be married. She was married when I was 50 years old. I remember very clearly because one of my friends had a party, a birthday party for me, and that was when probably on Thursday night before the wedding. Anyhow, the wedding was at our house. We had a tent, and we had music, and I was afraid that Les hadn't gotten fancy enough with the party, so I got the caterer on the side, and I said, bring a whole lot of shrimp and snow crab legs and so on and so forth. Well, he was very proud of himself for having such a beautiful party. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. Christopher had a hard time in school because he was dyslexic. It took us many years to learn about his dyslexia. We had sent him to a private school around Niagara Falls. Anyway, he went there for a year. It was the Gow School, and they finally said they couldn't help Christopher. And at that point, they didn't know about dyslexia. So we came back, and he was diagnosed at the public school, and we sent him to a school in Beverly, Massachusetts, the Landmark School. And I'll tell you something, it was a fabulous place. Christopher excelled primarily in cooking. I can remember when he was in grammar school, his most favorite A was in cooking. And it was a passion with him. And since we moved to Florida, Christopher came down after Les died. I helped him open a restaurant, and it's called CW's Barbecue. That's where we were last night, and it's still operating. The next one is Laura Lee. Laura Lee was a joy from the time she was born. She was never any trouble and was a very creative person. Leslie also was extremely creative. Laura Lee finally wound up with a passion for her garden, and she started painting from her garden, English country garden. I think it was English country garden. Anyway, she did that for a business and finally gave that up when the Chinese came in and, China was the one that produced her pottery for like cents in comparison to what it cost her to produce it. And she went into taking care of a autistic boy in grammar school. They asked her if she would come and be his one-on-one para. Anyway, she did fine, and that phone call we had a little while ago was Laura Lee saying that she has given 2 weeks' notice, and now all of a sudden she's going to be free to enjoy the week of my 80th birthday party up in Connecticut. The next one is Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was really, truly something else. She was nothing but trouble when it came to school. She just wasn't that interested, but a very smart girl. We put her in private school for a year. Well, I'll tell you, she had so darn much fun that we finally said, this is not what we're paying a whole lot of money for, and brought her back, put her back in public school. And unfortunately, they had, or I should say fortunately, actually, because she had to come to Florida with us when we decided to retire, because now Les had cancer, and he wanted to have a little life left. And I did get him to move to Florida. He wanted to have 2 places, one in New Jersey and one here, and I said I didn't think that I could stand taking care of 2 houses, and would he please come to Florida. And he did, and in about 6 months he absolutely loved it, and I couldn't even get him to go back to Connecticut or the Northeast in the summertime. But that's another story. He finally did. I was talking about Elizabeth. Elizabeth was engaged to a golf pro, and between the golf pro and his family, they got her to finish her college degree. And she graduated from Florida Atlantic University. Here we go again.
Okay.
Another day we'll continue about Elizabeth. Anyway, she did graduate, and she, as I said, was engaged to Mickey, and they went up to Connecticut, to Westchester in New York for him to work at a golf club. And she found out very soon after she was there that she really and truly wasn't interested in spending all of her life hearing about golf. So she decided to leave Mickey, and she went and lived with Laura Lee and Jim for a while. And she was helping Laura Lee with selling her pottery, and they were in Wilton at the Minks to Sink sale. And she went to a local deli, and in the deli was a young man and had two little boys in soccer uniforms, and she looked over and she said, "Buzzy?" And he said, "Yeah, who are you?" She said, "Elizabeth Collins." And he said, "Oh, no." Well, anyway, Buzzy had been Laura Lee's boyfriend in high school, and he hadn't seen Liz in years. Anyway, he was a big shot at the Gartner Group, and he said, "If you're interested in coming over and finding out what Gartner Group is all about," it was information technology. He said, "You come over." Well, I can't go into all that she did, but it was fabulous. And she has been with them, I think, a long time, just a long time, and she's been very, very successful, and I'm very proud of her. I'm proud of all the kids. There's so much to tell you. I wanted to tell you about my cousins. My mother was one of 4 children. I think I told you that. So there was Uncle Jewel. He married Aunt Dottie. He was the oldest of the kids, and their firstborn was Donald. And of course, he was the apple of everybody's eye. And then came Dorothy and their family, and then Virginia. And they lived out on Long Island, just a couple of, in Floral Park, a couple of streets away from me. And I used to go over there on Sundays, and Aunt Dottie made chocolate pudding every day of her life, I think. Anyway, I would go over there on Sunday and listen to the Green Hornet, which scared me to death. And I would have frankfurters and beans and chocolate pudding and whatever Aunt Dottie was offering that Sunday, and then I would come back home. Donald was a terror. He used to chase us girls with snake skins and all sorts of things, but he was a wonderful man, young boy, who was always interested in, well, animals and life. He was an Eagle Scout, and he was a wonderful person. Anyway, then came Mother, who had me, and my brother John, who will be only too happy to tell you he's 7 years younger than I am. And we had lots of fun together, but mostly after we were both married, because there was such a long span between our ages that there wasn't too much camaraderie. I was too interested in all the boys and so forth that was going on as we were growing up. Anyway, the next was Aunt Eleanor. And Aunt Eleanor had Lenore, and then Carol, and then Patricia. And Lenore was fantastic. She went to nursing school and met a doctor and married him. Carol was my absolute favorite cousin, and we did everything together. And I was with her when she met her husband, Bobby, at Jones Beach. Carol and I had a ball together, and I'm sorry to say that she's the first of the cousins who has died. And she went much too early. It's probably about 5 years now. But anyhow, she moved to Florida also, not that far away from me, so we did have some good times together while we were here. The next one is Aunt Madeline, and she married Walter when he was a widower with 3 children, and so she had Frank and Howard and Bernadette, and then they together had Marie. And Frank died very young from a brain tumor. And we were looking at pictures last night and wondering where Donald and Howard were. And I finally figured out that Aunt Madeline was married during the war. And Donald and Howard were over in, I think in Germany, fighting the war for the United States. Pat and her husband Dan came to visit me recently, and we had a very nice afternoon. I was very sad that I didn't get to see Lenore this trip because she comes to Florida for the winter, and my life is a little bit complicated with my brother being sick and Jet not being too well. I'll tell you about Jet later. Anyway, I do keep in contact with my cousins. And actually, Pete, would you get up and come over here, please, so we could see you in the picture just for a minute. I want to tell you about Pete because he's absolutely fantastic. He does all of this recording of people's lives. Now get your face in there. And he and Betty came down, his wife Betty, came down and really spent 3 days doing Jet's life and mine and having a lot of fun. We went and played golf yesterday. Anyhow, thank you, darling.
You're welcome.
Back to family. Grandma and Grandpa and Aunt Madeline rented a house, usually at a lake or some, for summers, all the time that I was growing up. And because Aunt Madeline was a school teacher and she had the summer off. And they always had one family at a time come and visit, and it was usually for 2 weeks. Maybe it was a week, what do I remember? Anyway, we went to wonderful lakes and just had wonderful summers with our grandparents. And every once in a while, if you were really, really good, you got to stay and spend time while the next family was visiting. And I know that Lenore and I were together, and Aunt Madeline, it was just Aunt Madeline. I think Grandma and Grandpa had gone back. And it was Aunt Madeline, Lenore, and myself, and we were at Candlewood Lake. And there was a huge storm, and you had to go over a bridge in order to get to our house. And we were in the town, and Aunt Madeline, I remember, bought us crayons and all kinds of stuff because this was supposed to be a long storm. And heaven only knows whether it was a hurricane, I don't remember. But candles, the whole thing. We got back, we hardly got over that bridge before it was underwater. Anyway, that was fun. Oh, a wonderful story was that Aunt Madeline was a little bit stressed. And after dinner she said, "Girls, I think that you should go to bed now. I'm very tired." And I said, "Aunt Madeline, if you're tired, why don't you go to bed?" That was a story that both Lenore and I remember. I don't know where I should go next. Maybe I should tell you about Les and his love for buying me presents. He absolutely adored buying me presents, and especially jewelry. He loved going to the Diamond District and the Gold District and buying things and then designing them. That was his thrill, and having them made up. And at one point he said to me, "Helen, if you don't get your ears pierced, I just can't buy you any more good earrings." And I said, "Les, I don't want to have my ears pierced." I said, "You buy me emeralds and I'll get my ears pierced." Well, it was a few years later, but I think it was our 30th anniversary, and he presented me with the most beautiful emerald earrings. And thank God he wasn't around when I lost one of them. But I did have a beautiful necklace made out of the one remaining earring. I know that he loved going to museums, and he would buy anything that was different. When we were in Greece, we were with another couple, and we had been to the museum, and I saw a ring that I absolutely loved in, of course, an old. Well, when we left there, he said, "I'll be back, wait for me on the corner." He was gone for over an hour, racing from one jewelry store to another to try and find this ring, a replica of this ring, and sure enough, he finally found one and met us on the corner, and off we went. That was the year that I think it was the year that he was 50 years old, and we took a 2-week Greek cruise, and then we went to Germany, and we went and looked for his grandma's, the house that she was born in. And there had been a castle there. We did find the place and the house that she was born in. Her mother was the cook for the family in the castle. Anyway, that was an interesting trip. Before I told you that he took me to Colombia, South America. That's not true at all. We went to Venezuela, and that's where I got so terribly sunburned. We did more trips, but after Les was sick with cancer, and really pretty much after we moved to Florida, we had to limit our trips to a month at a time, because he had to be back for either radiation or chemotherapy. And the man, well, as I said, he said make every day count. Well, he surely did. He had such a positive attitude, and the family behind him with a positive attitude. From the time he was diagnosed with cancer, he was in the 4th stage, but he lived almost 10 years in that 4th stage of cancer, and it was primarily this positive attitude. And so the first summer that we moved to Florida, we stayed put. But after that, we took a trip to England, and no reservations, just we went over on a ship and had a car waiting for us when we got off the ship, and that was it. We went up the west coast of England and down maybe we went up the east coast and down the west. Anyway, it was a fabulous trip. Wound up in London and spent every day online waiting to buy tickets for shows that night. I think we were there for probably 6 days a night, and I think we saw 5 shows. I'm trying to think of, the next trip was to Asia. And we flew over to Tokyo and had somebody pick us up at the airport. Tokyo was fantastic. We stayed there for a week, and then we went to China for 2 weeks. And now this was in 1987, I believe. Maybe it was 88. But China was not very upscale at that point. It was getting to a bathroom was just a horrible experience. But things have changed now, I think. From China, we went to Singapore and to Thailand and wound up in Hong Kong and then came home. Fantastic month. I can't remember what the next trip was, but sure enough, soon Les wound up in New York City at Sloan Kettering, and he was there for a couple of months, and they tried very hard to save his life, but he finally didn't have much left in him at all, and we came back down to Florida. He was here for 2 days and then wound up in the hospital up in Martin County. He wasn't at all upset about his life because he had really lived. And for me, there are so many people who are married for years and years and years and have done nothing. And I was married to this dynamo, and I had a fabulous life for 36 years. I think I'm finished for. I was very lucky to have Elizabeth still living with me after Les died. And we belonged to a country club down here called Turtle Creek. And in the 5 years that Les was alive, we developed quite a lot of friends. And I'll tell you, when a spouse dies, when you have friends and family behind you, and you decide that you need to make your own life, you can still go on living. And I've got to say that I've been doing a very good job of that. I started traveling with a friend. I insisted that we have a test, and we went to Disneyland for maybe 5 days a week. Anyway, boy, did I teach her how to live. She went on rides she never thought she'd go on, and it was a complete. I think it was through Delta Airlines, although we drove, but everything was included. And you had to sign up for meals. And I went down and I did that, and the woman said, well, why don't you go to the Victoria and Albert restaurant? And I said, oh, I know that's not included in our. She said, well, let me call up and see. And Victoria and Albert is at the top of, oh dear, what hotel? I'll tell you in a minute. Anyway, it's a very fancy round restaurant. And she got us a reservation at 9 o'clock at night. Everything was included except for a tip and liquor. Well, I'll tell you, in those days, and it had to be 1991, maybe 92, $75 for dinner was a lot of money. Well, that was included in our thing. We spent $1,000 each, and we were gone for a week and had 3 meals a day and went to all the best restaurants in at Disney. Had a great time. She made a mistake. The first morning that we woke up, she told me it took her an hour to get ready to go, and I should just not worry about her. Well, she had a curling machine, a curling iron, and she was in the bathroom, and she'd curl a curl and put this thing down on, I think it was marble. Anyway, it made such a noise. After about 6 whacks, I got up, I didn't say a word, I went into the bathroom, I took a towel, I put it on the marble, I put the curling iron on top of that, and went back to bed. I never had a problem with that kind of noise in the morning again, and we decided we could travel together. Well, we went on the first European trip, we went on one that was called Italy Grand and Leisurely. And that was a 3-week tour on a bus, but we spent 5 days in Rome, 5 days in Florence. We went to Assisi and were there for 2 nights. We went to Venice, we were there for 3 nights. Anyway, it was a wonderful trip. The next year, we decided to go back to Europe, and we were going to do a cruise. And the cruise left from Milan. Anyway, it was going from, I don't know where from. That wasn't Milan. Milan was when we went on the last trip. Anyway, this one was Amsterdam. But we planned this trip, and it was 2 weeks on the ship. We went from Amsterdam up to St. Petersburg, and then back through Germany and down and wound up in London. I saw her up at the club one night, and I said, Carol, we were going to stay in London for a week when we got back. We've both been to London. I said, I saw that this ship goes on and it does the European capitals. And I said, we could just leave our clothes on the ship and, spend the day in London and get back on the ship and go off and do the European capitals. And she said, you're nuts. And I said, I know. And she said, okay, we'll go. And so that's what we did. We were gone for a month, and it was fantastic trip. I just loved every minute of it. I know the next trip that we took was from Vancouver all the way down the coast in California, and down and through the Panama Canal, and then into New Orleans. And that was a month, and it was wonderful also. Since then, she died, and I was alone for a while, and all of a sudden my brother said that he'd met a man that I might almost like. And that turned out to be Jet. And sure enough, a very, very interesting man who adored traveling, had been all over the world. And shortly after I met him, he invited me to join him in going to Africa. And we went to Africa and Egypt. And that was I know we got back in November, and the following spring, I guess it was close to summer, we went out and did the West Coast. We saw my daughter Elizabeth and saw his sister and brother-in-law, and then we went up and spent time with his daughter and son-in-law in the Olympic Peninsula. And then we got on a train in Vancouver and started a trip through the Canadian Rockies. It was absolutely magnificent. I would recommend that trip to anyone. We ended that, and it was, just the beginning of the summer. And we decided, okay, we'd go to Europe. And we were going to go on a river cruise, but Elizabeth had been to Italy and had stayed on a farm, and people that we met in Africa, just a fabulous family, they said we couldn't come to Europe if we didn't stop and see them. So they were in Zurich, and so we started our trip in Zurich and rented a car there. It was they treated us like royalty. Then we got on. No, we rented a car, and I drove to Italy, and we stayed on this farm in Padua, and we were there for, I think, 6 days, and then I drove to Slovenia, and through the Alps. I mean, just absolutely magnificent, and we stayed at Lake Bled in Slovenia for about 5 days. What a gorgeous, gorgeous place. And then on to Vienna. We had to turn our car in Vienna because if you're over 60 years old, when you get to Prague, you can't turn a car in, and you can't rent a car in Prague if you're over 60 years old. So we had to go from Vienna to Prague on the train, and we had a couple of days on our own in Prague, and then we met the tour and spent another couple of days. As a matter of fact, that's a Tauk tour, and I would recommend Tauk to anyone. Just fantastic. Then we got on a boat in Regensburg and went to Budapest. Spent a few days in Budapest, rented another car, and then we drove a little bit through Hungary, And I had told Jet that I had not seen any of the Eastern countries, and I had certainly never been to Poland. And so we went to Poland, and of course he was very proud to show me his country. And we wound up in Warsaw, I think, and that's where his nephew came and picked us up and took us to Jet's cousin's home. And we stayed there for a couple of days. And then I always insisted that we fly first class, because now I'm getting a little old and I can't stand being in tourist class. So in order to do that, and in order to get a flight home, we had to go to Paris. Now, isn't that sad? So we spent 3 days in Paris and finally came back home. As I said, I'm going to be 80 years old, and I think I've talked quite long enough. I have a whole lot more that's been going on in my life, but I'm very happy to say that I have many friends, so many from up in Connecticut that I still spend time with, and also my friend Nancy, who I went from kindergarten through college with. And would you believe, Nancy's daughter has a place down here in Florida, and so Nancy has gotten a little condo probably about a mile away from me, so we get to see each other now. And just imagine, I think we met each other when we were 4 years old. She's much younger than I am. She's going to be 80 in September. Anyway, I've had a good life, and I hope that it's going to go on. Thanks, Pete.